and he had to take a pursuit angle, dive, shoestring tackle him. And in that process, he ran the fastest he's ever ran, wearing pads, which shouldn't happen, but it's because he had that external, I've got to go.
That was Justin Lima, and you're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. If you're in the world of sports performance, you've probably heard of jump testing mats. These mats use hang time to measure total jump height or contact time to measure quickness abilities off of the ground. The best jump mat that I've come across also happens to be a sponsor of this show, which is the Plyomat. The Plyomat is not only accurate, easy to use, and affordable, but it also allows you to string multiple mats together to add an extra dynamic to plyometric testing and training. To check out the Plyomat, you can head to plyomat.net. That's plyomat.net. Welcome to another episode of the podcast, and thanks for tuning in. Our guest this week is Justin Lima. He is a strength coach and educator, a consultant, and the owner of the Strength Coach Network. Justin has a Ph.D. in health and human performance, as well as extensive experience working as a strength coach in both American football as well as Olympic sport disciplines in the NCAA. On today's show, Justin will be talking about building a balanced speed program with the needs of sport practice. He'll talk about the nature of game speed, how to fill buckets that are not checked within sport practice or competition. He'll talk about strength training and the 1x20 system, alternative power training methods, this and much more on the show. Justin is a comprehensive thinker and communicator, and he has a profound perspective on the totality of the sport training process. This was a fun show to put together, and I'm excited to get it going here. Let's get to episode 413 with Justin Lima. Justin, welcome to the show, man. It's awesome to have you here. And you know, one of the things you had told me prior to this conversation was that you had gone from being a sport coach to a strength coach. So I'm just curious what prompted that transition, because I think it's interesting. Like a lot of the field, it's almost like with the motor learning and perception reaction, it's almost like a strength and conditioning and also work its way into sport. And tell me about that transition from sport into strength.
Yeah, and I will just say, first of all, thanks for having me on. I've been a big fan and listener for a long time. So to be here, this is awesome. And to answer that question, it's going to go back to James Frazier. He was one of my mentors at Harvard. So him and Tim Mullen. But I asked Frage, and I was like, hey, how come you didn't want to, go down the rabbit hole of working in the weight room? And he summed it up best. He's like, I like my family. I want to have a family. I didn't want to be on the road. And when I was a sport coach, you're recruiting, you're calling kids, working where I was working at a Division III school. I wasn't off recruiting, but you would sometimes, if there's a local game. And when he put it to me like that, and it made me realize that's what coaches are doing. They're off recruiting. They're gone Monday through Friday. They're sleeping in hotels. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to be a dad. I wanted to be a husband. And that solidified it for me, where if I'm a strength coach and I'm working with football, I can coach the entire team. So I'm not the head coach. I don't have to have a football background, but I can coach the entire team, have the most effect on people, and I get to be a husband and I get to be a father. To me, that was the why.
Yeah. In making that transition too, I mean, I guess one of the big things, that this isn't something I had outright in the question list, but it like just perspective on like kind of putting yourself in the other person's shoes. Like if the strength coach understands what it's like to be the sport coach, or vice versa, or sports medicine. Yep. I joked when I was at Cal, it'd be funny if like the strength coach and sports medicine switched places for obviously licensure you couldn't, but like just, for a month or something, just to like see what the other person had to deal with or do or whatever. Like, and so I'm sure that having that sport coach background, is there things that you feel uniquely kind of added to your perspective with what you were looking for in the weight room, how you saw transfer? I know I'm going to ask you some speed training stuff, and I've heard you say some really cool ideas with like what buckets to fill and how to do so. But is there any real unique elements you think stuck with you in that journey that gave you the perspective that you have now?
My biggest perspective was just understanding coach talk and understanding that they're not going to want to hear you really talk the depths of things. And I can nerd out super deep. Like I love strength and conditioning. I love talking sets and reps, and I can talk it for days. But as a former sport coach, understanding that the strength coach, or as a strength coach now and a former sport coach, I know that the sport coach, chances are they're not going to want to dive into the minutia. So how can I speak their terminology and get them to understand, like, okay, if it's a wide receivers coach, and being like, listen, coach, I understand it. And the reason that we're doing this perception action drill is if when we're playing against zone and it's a cover four and that corner's bailing and you're now teaching them to break that post off at 12 instead of 15, or it's a comeback route, like just understanding this is why we're doing this drill to train the OODA loop for them. Or if it's a lineman and it's like, hey, coach, we're grappling because clearly, if he's playing right guard and he's got a three technique and him and the tackle are chipping up to a 10 linebacker, like just being able to say those terminologies to them, it goes a long way. And so when I was working with different sports, whether it was softball, swim and dive, cross country, tennis, all volleyball, all the different terminologies that they utilize and go into their practice, that was the biggest carryover for me because they just want to know that you know what's going on in their world and you're not just trying to dictate to them.
Yeah. Yeah. That like shared language. I think, I know,
Correct.
like James Smith and global dynamics and all that. But it's interesting because it, in some ways, it seems like the shared language, if it comes from the strength coaching and the sports science link with the strength coaching, it can be very overwhelming, extremely technical, and like very, I think, potentially off-putting in that perspective. So to be able to almost put motor learning in the terms it typically is framed in on the level of coaching is, I'm sure, is really valuable.
Yeah. And what I would also do with the coaches is like, listen, when I'm asking you what drills or what things you're trying to do, like I'm not doing this because I'm trying to tell you what to do. I would literally be like, listen, if you want to run X number of deep routes on day one or day, whatever you want to do, like just tell me so I can make sure that they've done that number plus at least 20 more percent because I know you're going to want to do more than you said. And then now, okay, I know that number and I know where we're starting. Let me safely get us there and just being like, look, okay, you want to run deep routes. Okay, you're going to do it's not red zone stuff. And again, just being able to have that coach talk, that was one of the things that when I had the best relationships with sport coaches, that was at the heart of it all.
Yeah, makes sense. With your experience as a sport coach, strength coach, I'm really curious how you look at the totality of the speed development. Obviously, speed development, big thing. How do you really get that athlete-centered speed model in light of what they're doing on the field? So yeah, wherever you want to take that with what you've done or what you see as the pressing needs there, I'd be really curious to hear your opinion.
Well, I think it is a good segue from what we talked about logistically because that is one of the most important things. Like any strength coach listening to this right now, your program is predicated on A, the facility you have, B, the athletes you have, and then you can start worrying about everything else. So like if you don't have a facility, like there's been some members in Strength Coach Network that they've been like, hey, okay, this is my, off-season periodization plan. And I'm like, okay, I start asking questions and turns out they're getting ready to do summer or winter speed work, but they're in a climate where it's going to be snowing. They don't have a field. They have to be inside. It's on a court. It's not on so the reason that I'm saying all of this to preface it is you need to know your logistics. It can't just be very blankly, hey, do X program and this is it, plug and play. Very much like in the Bible, you need to learn how to fish instead of be fished for. So the logistics and all of that being said, I work backwards from the things that are going to happen. So like in the NFL, they get their schedule, they start looking, okay, what's international travel, what's short games, X, Y, and Z. For me, what I would do with the sport coach is I'd be like, all right, cool. Let's say the season is over and now we're getting ready to plan, January. Okay, cool. Hey, when are the players coming back? How long is break? When is spring ball? When does spring ball end? When are we reporting for summer? When are we reporting for camp? And you have all of those things. And then you just start reverse engineering it. It's like, okay, cool. Camp is going to be here. Awesome. We need to be doing X number of volume in terms of sprint work, time on feet. Cool. This is where we're going to be starting. Awesome. All right, we're ending spring ball here. That means I have this number of time to train them and hit on some qualities that they missed. All right, you're starting spring ball here. We're coming back on this date, but they had this long of a break off. Awesome. Now, once you have those knowns, you start piecing it in and start figuring out, okay, do I have access to different facilities? Because some of our strength coaches listening right now might realize they're sharing a weight room with different teams. They might not have access to certain fields. They have to drive a certain distance. So figure out, okay, Where are my facility constraints? How can I get the certain qualities that I need? Am I a team sport that has to touch max velocity? Cool. I have to make sure I'm touching it. Where can I touch it? Is it on a field at my own school? Is it a field that I got to travel somewhere else? Then in summer training, getting ready for camp, what we would do, okay, coaches, now that this new rule came out and you can do some individual skill work, when are you doing the individual skill work? Okay, if you're going to do individual skill work beforehand, let's put some speed work, micro dosed, put in right before you do that. Awesome. If you're going to do that, then it would be a speed before a lift. Cool. When we're done there, we will go up and go to the weight room. So that's where you just start looking at, okay, sport coach, at the end of the day, the athletes are there to play their sport. They have to win their games. Let them practice and then work backwards from there and see where you can piece in what you want instead of being like, all right, coaches, I trained them. Now they're yours. You go do your football thing because I got them bigger, stronger, and faster. Well, if you didn't work on perception action, if you didn't work on, understanding technical, tactical, you're not going to be as well prepared as if you truly integrate it that way.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure if you went back in time and were a sport coach again, because I've had this thought, I've asked a few people this, like, I'm sure you could easily do it all, like coaching, perception action, and coaching skill, strength that fits with your group. It's like a track coach. If you're the jumps coach, you do everything. If you're the throws coach, a lot of throws coaches do everything. Some people have the strength coaches, right? But you know what I'm saying? I mean, if if there was a different credentialing, you wonder if it was a different world sometimes. Like if there was more credentialing in the sport and education and the sport coach, do you think that like the perfect world, so to speak, would be one person doing kind of all the things, or at least the speed, strength, and then either sports science or high performance support? Or do you think that I'd be curious what your take is on that? Because I'm just curious. It's an interesting thought experiment.
Because there's so much involved in watching film and breaking things down and trying to read and trying to innovate, I would say no, that they just need to have a great relationship. Like,
Mhm.
so, you talked about throws, and at Towson, I was the head throws strength coach. I was so subservient to the guys that I work with, Tyler Burdoff, Zach Ball, and oh my goodness, Lonnie Pugh. Like all three
Mhm.
of them, when I work with three different throws coaches over 4 years, but we set individuals, the girls through individual all-time bests at the university. So they broke school records. We were winning indoor and outdoor team championships. We were winning individual medals. And all we did is we worked really, really well together. Like, okay, hey, so and so wanted to see more weighted rotation, even with a bar on the back. Cool. Let's do that. Let's make sure that I'm getting that programmed in there for you. They would throw, then they would come down into the lift. It would be a true extension of practice. So if you can get rid of your ego and work together and let that person be on Bondarchuk's pyramid of, okay, you're going to really handle CE and SDE, and we can work together of how this can kind of play into what you're doing out there on the throw. Okay. If you can get really, really specific into the weight room, hey, defensive line coach, if you think D line, they have to, combative, they're technically a little bit more offensive because they're going to be attacking the defensive linemen. Yes, they have to react a little bit if they're getting run blocked, but they're going to still attack outside shoulder. The qualities are just so similar that they have to be big, strong, and robust. I just feel like if you have a great relationship and let the person be their expert and truly just get rid of the egos, that's where the beauty lies. Because like my athletic trainer and I, Kyle Cherry, bro, you said it before. He was a strength coach in the off season because if we had somebody that was injured, he was just doing regressed training with the whole team. Isn't that being a strength coach? Like if I had a full 6-member staff, okay, you could, hey, give it to that, strength and conditioning coach over there. Well, in season, when he and the rest of the athletic trainers are taking care of the team and providing water and taking care of all the needs during the team at practice, and I'm rehabbing somebody, am I an athletic trainer? Like, obviously, with the licensing, we know where the lines are, but it blurs. And to me, that's where the beauty is when you can blur it, but you still know, hey, that's the expert. I'm doing things to help with that person. And now you're just complementing each other.
Yeah. I think with something that kind of popped up popped up as you were going through that. I was thinking, well, one, I think with track versus team sport coaches too, if you ask track coaches how many of them want to write the strength for the group, it would be a much, much higher percentage than team sport coaches that want to write the strength for their group. And I think that part of that might stem, Kevin Mulcahy said it well, is athletes who come up from places that really value free play and skill development. Those individuals tend just not to like the weight room that much compared to other cultures. And I think that sport and the chaos and the skill, I think that, I don't know, I just think that there's not as much compared to something that's more black and white. I think that there's more people within some of those more black and white sports who really enjoy the weight room piece of it. I mean, it's cool to hear your anecdote and how well you would work with the throws coach. And I agree with that. At the same time, it'd be hard to imagine Bondarchuk himself having a strength coach writing the weights for him. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. When he's coming up with the models, the SD, the SP, the GE, and like, I'm going to do this here, I'm going to switch it. Like, he has to be one brain, you know, if in that sense, because he's Bondarchuk, right? Like, so I get that, but there's not that many, you know, obviously there's different logistics and you know, there's different, I think there's different strengths in a department that can work together in that perspective. But yeah, it is an interesting, it's something I do think about because I like to think about, I think sometimes, you know, you think, well, you could do the best job you could in the weight room, but, you know, well, did you move the needle? Well, then, well, shouldn't the sport coach be doing everything? You know what I'm saying? Like, kind of like, where does one brain fit? These circles of one brain fit in. These are things I think about, but probably some of them not logistically manageable.
And so hearing you say that, like now with my CEO brain on, and it's like, okay, yeah, Bondarchuk with the pyramid and all the, but like, what if he could have freed up some more time if he had a strength coach that he worked really well together with, right? Or like finding that ability to buy yourself more time. Like, okay, cool. You're going to handle, like we've got this true symbiotic relationship and we understand what you're doing in the weight room. And these things are going to pair really well here. Cool. You handle that. And right now I'm going to go watch the techniques from throws. I'm going to go watch what happened. I can do other things while I like delegating, right? Hey, you can get this done and you're not going to delegate the most important things because yes, you need to be watching the throws practice. But now maybe when they're out at throws practice, I can be tinkering around and learning, okay, what's a different methodology that I can play with, and just that continual growth where you're pushing each other to get better. And how can you work those systems and just understanding, hey, I'm going to do this one thing really, really well, and we're going to complement each other really, really well. And I'm going to give you time because you're going to do the thing, that only thing. Like to me, that's just when you have multiple people, it allows you to have multiple time or more time because everybody's got the same 24 hours. And if we're working 8-10 hours, you plus me, that's 20 hours instead of just me and the things that my limited bandwidth is.
Sure. I could see that. I know some of my last years in the NCAA, I was starting to see like some of the track coaches, or what I remember a track coach sat down next to my desk and was like, hey, I got to fill out my Kara reports. This takes me so many hours a week. And I looked, I was like, wow, that sucks. Like, yeah. I mean, and for someone who has all that on their plate, I can definitely see, you know, it being a helpful thing when someone can help make decisions on the strength side. But I think for someone who's like a pro coach, like a Bondarchuk type, I don't know. I think that there is a value for those types to exist, in my opinion, because I do think there needs to be situations where you are doing everything. And I also think, too, it is funny because it's like, well, what if you would have freed up Bondarchuk to do more in the throws? But I find it humorous because, like you said, like don't ABC too much with the reps.
True.
Don't ABC too much. And it was Kidway Johnson was on the show, or maybe it was Andrew Sheaf. One of those two had said something about, well, I think Kidway couldn't even understand Bondarchuk, what he was even trying to say. But a lot of it was just like push the hammer. Like that's, according to Andrew, like that's pretty much like one of the main things he said is push the hammer. And it was like kind of, you know, this little nebulous, like, am I pushing the hammer? What does it even mean? I'll just go out and try again, you know, but it was almost part of that like thing. It's like a Zen like thing. Like, what is the answer to that? But it forces you to keep just engaging with it in a way where you actually aren't led on by maybe one particular thing. Now, I'm not saying that's the magic bullet for all coaching, but I do think it's valuable to have a little bit of that self-discovery. All that's just needless to say is I think, you know, each system has its own, you know, it's funny to imagine like it's almost like that's this is a system that really relied on the container, and then the athlete could figure it out in the container until they adapted, and then now it's a new container. And the beauty of it was the design of the container, top to bottom. I mean, I suppose like, the GE layer probably didn't matter that much, which is like the little auxiliary stuff, like that. But and in some sense, I don't know, my mind would say maybe you could bring like maybe there you could bring like someone who's really good with like maybe some of the interesting, some of like the fascial lines or some of that stuff in for the G. Maybe that would be where that would fit most easily. That's just where my brain, I guess there's always a place, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. But I think a professional coach with no other major responsibilities versus someone in it who's got to like do all this minutia and, wherever you can free that up. So, yeah.
One of the things too that I think is valuable though is giving the athletes a different person to just hear from and be around, because
I agree
then the two coaches can be good cop, bad cop versus, or not even good cop, bad cop, but just different. And if some of the athletes aren't relating to, or, and if they're struggling, whatever, hey, coach was mean to me, throws coach was mean to me today, or it's like, hey, like, okay, maybe you can then get something better out of that weight session, because now they can detach and they can just be away from that person for a little bit. And it's like, okay, maybe they were, maybe they weren't, but it's just a different person, because we're humans, we work with humans. When you can relate to them and have that different relationship, you can maybe get a little bit more out of them in the weight room. So that's to me where, yeah, I have that bias, but yeah, there's obviously there are the exceptions, but to me, the rule, when you can just have that, and I've seen it, I've had athletes where they come to me and they're crying about X, Y, and Z, guys and girls, and they just need to get it off their chest. And then it's like, hey, do you want to go train? Yeah, I do. And they wind up having one of their best days ever. So it's like that's why there's the yin and the yang.
Yeah, I actually that one really hits hard. Like I completely, I was even just thinking, I mean, one, my experiences as a strength coach myself, I saw that. And then also even in being an athlete. So my best years of track as a jumper, the main coach was kind of like the strategist. Like he came up with really good, a great framework, like a Bondarchuk, here's the workouts. He was really good at that. But his personality was a little dry. I felt like and I was so hard to coach. I mean, I was like, if I didn't think because I had studied it and I was arrogant. And so if I didn't feel like whatever was being communicated was on some particular level I had decided in my head, I just wouldn't listen. And so I can only imagine what it was like to coach myself. Probably not a lot of fun. But the assistant, but he was an amazing coach at creating the structure. And my physical abilities were all increasing in a really steady and consistent manner. But then the assistant coach was a very, very personable and really good at getting him and engaging with people's minds. And he knew what to say to me to help me believe in myself. And he also knew what to say with a technical perspective. Instead of saying, do this, he's like, hey, I talked to my Russian high jump buddy, and he said they would do these drills. And then, of course, I would just start doing that, so if it was not for that duo, I wouldn't have done what I did 100%. And so it's like, I think you're totally right. Having that like polarity, a different person to bounce things off of, if it's only one person, you probably get sick of them at some point a little bit. So yeah, I totally hear you on that. That definitely makes good sense. So I did want to get more into a little bit of the nuts and bolts of some of the speed stuff and the buckets. Yeah. And maybe where I just thought it was fascinating. You had a podcast, you were on Jay DeMayo's podcast talking about like basically filling the buckets. Like if the team's already gone through practice, you had talked about like doing, I think it would be common for someone to be like, all right, we're going to do, 10 20s or something, or 2 sets of 10 20s or whatever, consistent repeat sprint ability. But you had talked about, hey, maybe we'll just do like this microdose of curvilinear runs. And I just found it really interesting. Could you go a little bit more to the nuts and bolts of some of the specific like microdoses, the complements that you do for the main practice?
Yeah, and I mean, DeMarco gave me a ton of this stuff on the curvilinear, and it might have been on one of your podcast, but I had never like, A-cell max velocity, that makes sense, change of direction, agility. But when I first learned about curvilinear, I was like, gosh, that is so simple. Why didn't I think about that? And then curvilinear with contact. So the way that we would go about programming it in the weight room is or not in the weight room, but on the field, is we would have A-cell dominant days, max velocity days, and then curvilinear / change in direction agility days. But that would be after our GPP phase. So in a GPP phase, we're going to talk about 1 by 20, but I called it 1 by 20 on the field, where we would need to get some ACL, some max velocity, some curvilinear, some change in direction, and some agility work,
Mm.
just a little bit each day. And then once they've been exposed to all of them at lower intensities, extensive before intensive,
Hmm.
now we can get into the intensive. Now we can start really hitting those things. Yes, maybe I would use the curvilinear sprints as my max velocity work during that GPP phase, or it would be a 10-yard fly with a 5-yard buildup, which we all know is not true max velocity, but it's introducing the gates, it's introducing the idea of putting a time on it and getting the athletes running. So that's how we would go about doing it. We would always then figure out utilizing our GPS. All right, how many reps do we need to do to make sure that we're hitting the number of total yardage above 90% that we want to see based off of what they're going to see in camp. And so we would just have the GPS laptop out there. We'd have our plan, we'd have it written down of what we needed to do. And then we would just make sure, hey, did we go above? Did we go below? Are we right where we need to be? Get a couple extra reps, get a couple less reps. And that would all be during our off-season prep, so before we're in season. But then in season, if we were having guys that didn't have that, the old coaching staff that I worked with, we would be really good where right after the warm-up and right after Indy, the coaches would go and hit, and I'd give them 5 reps, or excuse me, 4 reps, and say, hey, this position group, they need to go 10-yard sprints because the lineman. All right, let's get the mids. They need to be hitting a 15 to a 20-yard reps. You can do, I'd give them some choice again, right? Like with my kids, do you want ham or do you want turkey? Hey, do you want them to run 15? Do you want them to run 20? Because I knew that they'd eventually get close to that threshold. And we would program that in, typically just the 4 reps, because by the end of it, they'd be hitting the required yardage that we wanted to see, that we knew that they would need to be hitting come game day. And that's how we would dose it. Typically, my tight ends, I don't know why, they're the ones that had to do more sprints during practice. And I think it's just personnel wise. So, anybody listening to this, maybe if you're in a heavy run offense and you know that your tight ends aren't getting a lot of it unless it's full punt return, full kickoff, any of the special teams, those are the days you have to dose it in. But you also have to be aware if you're in season, all right, are you doing it on your Tuesday or your Wednesday instead of in spring ball? All right, what is it going to be? Is it that, you know, first day back in practice, so typically a Tuesday, or is it going to be your Thursday in spring ball, knowing that you're probably going to get a lot of contact on Saturday?
Today's podcast is sponsored by TeamBuilder. You can get a free trial of their training portal software by heading to teambuilder.com, and you can use the code JUSTFLY for a 30-day free trial. Sign up today with TeamBuilder and see what they can do for you for your training programs and your team. Yeah. Is it common for people to look at like how many routes, how much sprinting and practice did a person or group do, and then use that to decide how much they do afterwards? Or is that forthcoming? Is that something that's coming up?
That's exact. And you're going to have people that are watching practice that, and again, it goes to the head coach and how much that head coach values it. But there will be people watching practice being like, hey, Johnny is done because Johnny hit that total number of high speed stuff. And hey, coach, where do you want him to get his most amount of work? Okay, I don't really care about install. I don't care about Indy. 7-on-7 is not as big of a deal, but I need him to understand in team settings that when that safety, when they go from, the 2 deep look and they start to invert to a cover 1 or a cover 3, that they have to change their post route. Like that's where I need that person. And so those high level conversations, those are starting to happen off of the field. And then that's where the sport coach and the strength coach will be like, okay, hey, you're going to take so-and-so during this period of time. So that way they're warm, they're able to go and perform for us during this team period. Versus conversely, sometimes they'll be like, hey, I just want him at the beginning of practice. I'm going to take him. I'm going to do all the work that he needs to do. Then I want him to just be shut down. I want him to watch. He can do some bike conditioning or whatever things to keep his aerobic fitness up. Or there's the third option of, hey, we're just going to give him a couple of reps, fewer reps that he normally would do in all of the drills. So he'll do all of 1-on-1. He'll do all of 7-on-7, all of red zone, all of team. But instead of getting 8 of the 16 reps, he's just going to get 6. He might get 5 based upon whatever the reason, whether it be injury, total number of yardage that he's already hit during the day. But that will be case by case dependent on the school and the coach and the athlete.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. That's really cool to hear how everything like, just I don't know, it's so I feel like it's interesting or the more there's like data and the more understanding of workloads, I think that really offers some interesting possibilities for how you actually come through with that stuff with a big chaotic environment with all sorts of different things happening like that.
Especially when you do it right and you do it and you understand, like, listen, you don't need like, and I think minimal effective dose has gotten a bad rap because too many coaches that don't understand it and everything like, oh, it's the minimal effective dose. What about like max recoverable volume? How can we
Mm-hmm.
push, right? It doesn't always need to be do the least amount of work to get it done. Like sometimes you have to actually bake the cake, do the difficult things so that way they can hold on to those gains longer and that minimal effective dose can be, it is valuable at the time that you go to apply it.
Yeah. Uh, you were saying that the GPP, you did basically everything every day, kind of like almost like if you played basketball every day, I guess, for lack of a better analogy,
Yep.
like just everything every day. And then once you get past GPP, then it's like, then it starts to fall into more specific, like linear change of direction. How would those fall on once you move to the, I guess, SPP or whatever the next is, how do those days tend to fall, like specifically throughout the week for you, or
So
as you see it?
at first, what we would do is we had and I'm going to put all of this in context. We had a massive break. Like our
Mhm.
guys would have up to 6 weeks, sometimes 7 weeks way the calendar fell. And sometimes we had 3 weeks to get ready for spring ball. So it's like, this is going to be tight. Then there's been other times where we had that long of a break and we had 7 weeks off. So I'll go with that example. And what we would do is we would run 2 weeks of if we were going to be doing speed work, we would hit it Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and it would be those were our high CNS days. So it would be speed work, some acceleration, some max velocity, and the acceleration might literally just be if they had that long a time off, 5 yard max effort, 5 yard sprint.
Hmm.
And we might even put them in a push-up position, half kneeling, whatever, just understanding horizontal projection. The max velocity, again, it might be a 5 yard fly into a 10 yard, 5 yard build into a 10 yard fly. We might put hands on top of the head. We might put hands out in front of them to
Mm-hmm.
constrain their arms so they weren't hitting true max velocity instead of trying to tell them, hey, run it, 80% of your max velocity. Sure, no, run as fast as you can, but we're going to constrain your arms so you can't hit that max velocity. We'll do some S curve, we'll do some C curve, probably one of each. Again, everything totality 12 to 16 total reps throughout the day. It might be a little bit like, okay, we might do some more ACell on this day, some more max velo on this day, and some curve and change in direction, but all of the qualities would be put in. Additionally, during that time, we would be doing our lifting where it was again a 1 by 20 and it would
Mm-hmm.
be okay, we're going to do a 1 by 20 lower body day paired with that. We're going to then do a 1 by 20 upper body day on Tuesday, Thursday, and then we would do tempo runs, grappling, and even if we weren't going to do true linear tempo runs, we would do a tempo run or just tempo 8 vector work and just having them change direction. But again, this truly being the below 70% effort, no yelling. I would tell the sport coaches,
Mm-hmm.
like, we're not like, stop, that this is not the time. Like, we're not doing this. And then after those 2 weeks, that's when we would get into, your true Mondays for us was our ACell heavy day just because these kids couldn't handle doing any like people would be like, oh well, they're fresh after the weekend. No, they weren't. They would go out, they would not be fresh on Monday.
Ah,
They could do heavy and they could grind. So we did that on Monday. Tuesday we would do an upper body and the tempo work would be very, very small doses because we didn't want to do anything on Tuesday that would mess up Wednesday because Wednesday was our money, get them feeling good. They're back into training for 2 days. We fed them. They're in a routine. And then Wednesday we could really go with the max velocity work, especially weather permitting. Pair that with a dynamic effort in the weight room. Thursday we would do more tempo work than we did on that on the Tuesday, and then Friday would be our curvilinear change in direction work, and we would put a time Monday, Wednesday, Friday on everything. So the ACell work, we would even if we were doing contrast works, weighted, free, assisted, the free would be timed, ranked, recorded. The max velocity work, recorded, ranked, published. It would be posted in the weight room. It would be texted to the players it would be emailed to the coaches, and then we'd put it up on social media too. The curvilinear work, we would set the cone, the gates where they would curve in one way, curve out the other way. So like if we did a curve to the right, a curve to the left. If they did an S, it would be the entrance and the exit. We would let them, we'd record both to the right or to the left, and then we would just record, rank, publish the best. We could do a 505 or a modified 505 is how we would do our timing work on our Excel, or excuse me, on our change in direction day. Then the way that we would pair the change in direction or the curvilinear work on the field would be unilateral and multi-directional in the weight room on the lower body emphasis. Our Tuesday, Thursday would be an upper body day, tempo running for our skill players, and then grappling work for our linemen, or tempo side shuffle. So they would be just shuffling side to side, doing a med ball chest pass. So that way they're working on hip abduction, upper body pressing work, because that's what they have to do. And we would run that for, again, 5 weeks until we're getting close to spring ball or until we're getting ready for the season. And even within those 5 weeks, realistically, that's what we're doing for 3, because those last 2 weeks, well, now we have to start introducing some of that lactic work, and we have to introduce some shuttles. So, okay, realistically, we might only go to a 2 high day, 3 lower days, and then eventually switching it to, okay, now we're really going to start to replicate what's going to happen in one of those longer practices, because now the kids need to be on their feet for a really long time. And we might just completely drop out a day in the weight room, and we're just going to be on the field. So that way they are getting ready for the stuff on the field, because that's what they get hurt.
Yeah. Yeah. As you were talking about the different rankings, well, I had a couple of thoughts. Well, one, I know you've had Sean Mishka on your podcast, and I know Sean has talked about, and I think there's a level, right? Like there's a get in the door level of speed that you have to be fast enough. And then there's a level of speed that it fails to transfer at some point unless there's a perception or reaction looping. And but you mentioned the curvilinear, which like the thing that I guess intrigues me is if you're rank recording and publishing, keeping those stats, would you feel like, and again, there's not perception or reaction. You're not perceiving a person in a curvilinear sprint by itself. But do you feel like there's forms of locomotion you track that may have correlated more to people who are starters versus others, like a curvilinear sprint versus a linear or anything like that?
No, because our fast kids were still going to be fast. Like they could accelerate from that dead stop, right? And then they're going to eventually get to the, to just be fast. And to me, what I started to find was like, it just pushed, like our coaches love to hear like competition, right? Anybody listening to this, they know their coaches want to hear competition. They want to see who's working. So right there, you're getting that quality. But to me, it'd be like anything else. Like, all right, if we're raising the ceiling on max velocity, we're getting them exposed to it, so that way they can continually hit that training and that effect. It's like anything else. That means the submaximal speed that they're going to be hitting when they're having the perception action. Like I understand at max velocity, they'll get their foot greater separated from the ground than they would when they're playing their sport, because they have to change direction. But if we're just going to increase that quality and get them faster, their max velocity over time, then that means that submaximal speed when they are in that game mode and they're perceiving. Like a perfect example is Desmond King. I work with Desmond at the University of Iowa, and they tried saying that he was slow because he ran a 4.5 4.40 in his pro day. Why was he first team All-Pro punt returner and second team All-Pro corner in 2018? Because he was game fast, understood when to accelerate, understood when to change direction. Shane Simpson, who I work with at Towson, Shane was same thing. He was right around a 4.57, 4.56, and never got caught from behind at Towson, or even when he transferred up. We did not have a spring season or a fall season because of COVID. So he transferred and went to Virginia in the ACC, took a screen to the house against UNC, the Tar Heels, back when they were ranked 10th, like game speed. And so if you can drive those metrics up, just like anything else, now when you're hitting that 90-ish% and you're trying to perceive and see what's going on, and then you turn the jets on, to me, that's why you would just keep doing that all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. I love hearing those anecdotes about those people whose their 40s wasn't like amazing, but then they get in the game and they're just animals. Like that just intrigues me, that difference. even too, like the thing of like having stimuli of other players, like people who can take that energy and use it, if that makes sense. Versus, I think that does go beyond like that kind of gets more into maybe some psychological factors. But I say that because I feel like I was always a little bit like that too. Like I at least like linear sprint metrics wasn't as fast as I could play. And I always was curious a little bit why that was,
So
for a variety of
two
reasons.
more examples on that. We had a kid, Diego Hunter, who took our opening kickoff to the house against West Virginia. So they're a Big 12 school. We're in a money game, right? Trying to make money for the school. And they score a touchdown. So it's 7-0. We get the ball kicked off to us. Hey, we tie the game 7-7. Diego never reached greater than 20 miles an hour. And this is like, now he was a routine 21. He was 21-3. Like he never got
Mhm.
higher than that. I was never one of those people that like, we had catapult and that was
Mhm.
where we had our speeds came from. But it was because he got tackled, got out of the tackle, and then made a juke move. And he was that little jitterbug. He was the special teams
Yeah.
player of the year, right? And he was stuttering, and then he was really great at reaccelerating, hitting the speed he needed to, figuring out how to, evade a person, bump off a person, and then ultimately go and score the touchdown. Another example was Daniel Raymond hit 22 miles an hour, his fastest recorded speed ever, but he was in pads. But like you said, he was on the backside of a play where they were running like a swing pass to the running back, and he had to take a pursuit angle, dive, shoestring tackle him. And in that process, he ran the fastest he's ever
Mm,
ran
yeah.
wearing pads, which shouldn't happen, but it's because he had that external, I've got to go.
Yes.
Like,
Yeah, what was the angle again? I wasn't sure exactly what you're saying, but I was thinking just from the track world. One thought I had was that sometimes the highest speeds in track come in the 200 meters. You have the bend and the straight,
oh, yeah,
obviously,
yeah, yep,
and it's like a slingshot. Like if you run a good
yep.
curve, you come off of that curvilinear and hit the straight, and it does something where that rotation feeds into this linear shot, and
That
you feel it.
centrifugal force, and
Yeah,
you're just
yeah,
like, whoa, I'm going. And so
yeah.
what happened for him was, like, if we're looking at the field here, the receiver caught the ball out of the backfield and was running up the sideline, and he was on the other side and kind of had to like, he kind of did like a parabolic curve, like kind of
Yeah.
curved into the
Yes.
where the rest of the field was, and then just it took a great angle. Like, all right, I have to run to the 10-yard line, even though he's at the 50, and then shoestring dive. And again, I was like, dude, Daniel, you just ran 22 miles an hour, like, post game when I was breaking down all the data. But it was like, and that was the other cool part. You want to talk anecdotes? Like, players would come over to me on the sideline during the game, be like, hey, check my speed on that play. Like, and so
That's
I'd
awesome.
write it down. I'd be like, all right, Luke Hamilton at 3:45, take a look. And I'd be like, hey, bro, you were right. Like, you hit the fastest speed you've ever hit. And he's like, that's right.
That's
So
funny. That's awesome. It makes me think too about like like that parabola and the curvilinear. It almost would be like maybe a thought in constructing game if you wanted to eke out a max speed. But I back to it though. I love your constraining max speed, like when you do the flies and constrain the arms, like just because hey, you're probably running fast in practice already a lot, and it's like, well, how much more this in the exact same way? Or I mean, yeah, linear sprint, I guess like a fly 10 isn't necessarily going to happen all the time, in a lot of football situations, but I did think that was something that was really interesting. I was gonna say that I think it'd be interesting to do like curvilinear, like chase curvilinear into like a fly in a practice setting. I'd just be curious, But then you don't want to lose the magic though either. Like that's what makes some of the things the game so cool. When those things just happen organically or it happens in play, and it's like wow, Versus hey, let's take this and let's like microize it and make sure.
And that was the thing. Like, you just had to find a way. Like, all right, if we're going to do it on Tuesday, hey, coaches, let's put them in a, like, DB, put them in a trail position so that way they go, like, and again, you got to make sure you get a good enough ball thrown because,
Yeah,
unless it's in that heat of the moment, it's hard to recreate, which is
yeah,
why, like, realistically, you were happy if you were getting, hey, 92, 94%. Like, all right, cool. We're hitting it. We know we're going to hit it again on come Saturday. And then what would start to happen? It'd be like, hey, coaches, like, we didn't hit that. Like, now we need to do a couple more reps on the Tuesday. And they were again super hesitant because what's the last thing they want? They don't want to see somebody get hurt. And it's like, listen, we have to respect the prior game and appreciate the one coming up, which was why it's like, hey, let's do it on Tuesday. They've had, full day off on Sunday. They like, okay, give them practice Wednesday, or excuse me, Monday, then let them run really fast. Okay, now you can introduce contact on them because that's the thing that you're always trying to balance within the sport of football is they have to run fast and they have to handle contact and they have to handle all the changing in direction. Like, which one are you going to put the onus on because they all have an effect on winning and losing?
Yeah. I think that's you hearing you give that anecdote as well just reminds me of how good like a team sport is for track and field in the sense of like those players, those like all the variability, all the repetition without repetition, doing all these different shaped sprints, a lot of them ending up in linear, and a lot of them have different lengths and intensities. There's just such a powerful, both a learning and a physical development that comes from that if you are going to go do track and in the spring or, if it's in a high school situation. I just think and the more I hear about that, I've always known, but it's so cool to see and hear those ideas of how that comes out. And then, yeah, so I like the relationship between the two. I know we don't have a lot of time. I want to get into, you mentioned 1x20, so I want to touch on that briefly, and then I want to get into the power and power development, Olympic lifting, or moving from Olympic lifting type stuff. Just 1x20 briefly. I know, having Kieran, Jeff Moyer, those guys. It just seems, it just seems like such a simple and effective way to slowly move the needle forward. Just tell me about your use of it. Do you use anything else for like football, or thoughts on how you mix it with other things? Curious on your progression with that system.
So anybody listening to this that is going to be skeptical, I'm going to tell you, I was a skeptic myself. The first time I heard about it was on the roundtable episode that you had with everybody. I was like, what are these people talking about? And instead of actually having an open mind and trying it, I was closed off about it until I heard about it more. So if I'm speaking to any of you, just go try it with yourself before and do a version of what I'm talking about now. But I wouldn't go, like, I didn't go and do the give 5 exercises, really, really teach them, and then add layers of more exercises over time. And maybe this was a flaw of my own, but when I worked at Iowa, one of the things that Coach Doyle said when we were taking guys through our version of the FMS, we didn't do the FMS, we did a version of it, but his whole thing was like, he was talking about one of the former assistants where he marked the person down for like bad mover, bad mover. He's like, were they really that bad of a mover? Like, you know what I mean? Like calm down. And so to me, if the whole 1x20 is younger athletes, everything we know is neural adaptation, and they need a motor learn and learn how to do the movement. And I talked about Coach Wilson before, where it's like, hey, they do a rep, they know it was bad, they need time to do the rep. And that's everything about the 1x20 is let them learn by doing. Let them learn by doing lots of different movements and really find ways to like, all right, what's your bilateral push? Do a bilateral push, do a unilateral push, do a frontal plane movement, a transverse plane movement. You can do a hip flexion movement, a hip abduction, a hip adduction. You can do a calf movement. You can do a shin movement. You can then break your torso into inner unit, flexion, lateral flexion, extension, anti-extension, anti-rotation, rotation, anti-flexion. And you can come up with exercises for all the different buckets. And then upper body, obviously, as well. Your presses, your pulls, vertical, horizontal, unilateral, bilateral. And you've got all your different movement categories. And you're going to have a solid hour to train your athletes. So give them the exposure to it and be like, hey, put the least important movements at the end. And if you can't get to them, you can't get to them, but you have them there. And then you start to progress through. And so what we would do, again, depending on the time, but we would typically go, and if we were going to get two sessions during the week, we would do a 1x20, same exercises, 1x20, 2 to 3 weeks, especially if they're really novice, 3 weeks, so they can actually get something out of it where that last week, maybe they stopped at 19 reps or like the weight's getting a little bit too heavy. And then from there, we would go to the 14s and go to the 8s. I didn't do the 8s velocity-based training style like Jeff had talked about or Tommy had talked about before. We would truly do them as heavy. And then at the end of it, we would, again, my choice was we would go back to the top and we would go a 20 and a 14. Same, we didn't change the movement. Get them good at it. And then what we did do is we would start to take out, okay, if you had too many exercises, because now you're adding multiple sets. Okay, some of those auxiliary movements, if you will, let's make sure that we're hitting that quality in the warm-up, right? So let's find ways to start paring down the warm-up, still hit hip abduction, hip adduction, hip flexion, in the warm up, not just a sole isolative exercise because they had done it for so long. Then once we get to the eights, okay, we'll do a 20, a 14, and an eight, really the major movements. And then from there, we'll go back to a 1x20, but we'll actually now change the exercise. So if we had a bilateral, if we're going to go 2 days, we'd go maybe a goblet squat and a front squat. And then now we've changed the movement, but we can go back and now we're going to run that for at least 3 weeks because the movements are different. So we don't need to progress too soon. And coaches, if you're listening to this, you're going to want to progress it soon. Your athletes are going to be bored. I had a freshman that he was a freshman, his redshirt freshman, but his redshirt freshman year, he got sick of doing it. But I tell you what, I mean, by the end of it, he got super duper strong. And that's the thing. Like he didn't want to keep doing it, but by the end of it, when we finally put him on a normal card, quote unquote, he had a 555 deadlift, trap bar deadlift.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just like, I know you don't want to do those things, but it's gonna get you super duper strong. It sounds boring, but it works. And one of the examples of one of the he was a sophomore at the time, and I do Cal Dietz's sport squats, not a back squat, just with the hip anatomy of all my different athletes. So we truly just called it a sport squat. And he did 495 for 14. And I was like, you know what, Dion? You are off of this 1x20 card. Like you have been promoted. Like you're strong enough. Like at that point, I need to move you along.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so interesting. Part of my intrigue also comes with how Dr. Yessis came up with that. Like I bought the old Super Squats book by Randall Stossel or something. And I was like, this has got to have worked in here. I was talking with Dan John about like, Boyd Epley and moving forward off of that. And there was, moving into like a lot of different exercises. And I'm just curious what hit Doc's brain in the 80s or whatever it was that I would have loved to ask that to him before, just because it's so different. It's just such a different kind of train of thinking versus typical.
According to Yosef, Doc made it up. And Yosef said it on our podcast. He's like, Doc made that up. He's like, in terms of the terminology 1x20, he's like,
sure.
Now, what went through his brain to come up with the whole notion of, motor learning, a lot of repetition, like all the tried and true principles of, anybody listening, like, hey, 1x20 is lifting a moderate load for a lot of repetition so you can get exposed to a lot of different joint action. So that way you can learn different movements. And if you use a moderate weight, you can train multiple days in a row and not be sore. So yes, that it's how he thought of all that would be super interesting to hear. But Yosef said in terms of the name 1x20, he's like, according to Yosef, Doc came up with it. And I was like, God, that would have been so funny to hear him like pitch it to you,
Yeah, back in the day. I always feel like we're a product of at least something else going on in the same time frame. Like I don't know. I don't think anything is, how many things are the true unique, unless Doc had this just download from the universe that's so like I don't know. I feel like there's other stuff. There had to have been. What was I gonna say? I think that's so interesting though. It's almost worth mentioning in the sense like you mentioned like the yin and the yang or the balance before. I think that even like the Bondarchuk pyramid, you have the competitive thing, that's gonna be more skillful, probably more entertaining by nature. But then you get to the bottom and you have things that are more general. And of course the bottom layer is very, like Abu Shakespeare said, like a lot of the general stuff can be varied and interesting, but I think that there is somewhere in there needs to be, Aaron Cantor had mentioned this, like a withholding. Like we live in this dopamine culture, and I think to balance a program on some level, be it, I even look at bodyweight isos as that perspective. Like on some level, I think there's cool adaptations, but I think there's also withholding. I've even taken it to the point too, sometimes, this just being in my own training, where I won't let myself go for a certain sprint effort unless I hold the ISO a particular amount of time. Because it's kind of like, you just want to go for the thing, but you kind of also, and you hold it ISO for 3 minutes, you get the lactic of the Cori cycle, it clears out after 10 minutes and you're good. Like it's not the end of the world. It actually eventually can be a supercharger. But I think about that a lot because I think it's very easy. There was a good email that just came out recently by guy Gerwinder. It was a games culture. It's like we live in this games culture where games are used for everything. They can be used for good, they can be used for bad, but at the same time, it's like just there is a value in things there's like a slow, steady withholding, almost like a fundamental. It's like there is something something should be fundamental somewhere in the structure that is kind of boring. But, because it's like, well, if everything is fun, you know what I'm saying? Like there should be something that is withholding on some level. For me, it's usually more ISOs, but I think I've used 1x20 and I think that can be an amazing way to do that as well.
And I think what it also helps do is it helps kids see progress because, like you said, I mean, training can be boring. It can be difficult. Typically, your best athletes maybe don't like to train. But what they start to see is they start to see this linear path of like, all right, I come in, I'm doing this 1x20 thing. And like you get to, it's almost like misery loves company and like you earn your stripes. It's like, yeah, I went through that 1x22. Like,
Mm-hmm.
oh man, it was boring, but like, he was right. I got stronger. And it's like the rolling, the contact prep progression and like our forward rolls and our tumbling. The kids hated it until the football was brought out in spring ball or in camp and they saw somebody dive for a football, roll safely, stand up. They'd all look at me and say, that's why we roll. And I'd say,
Mm-hmm.
yes. And that 1 second of gratification after 8 weeks was all I needed. But the same thing would occur once, they go through the 1x20. You're like, oh, I got stronger, coach. Thank you. You're right. And then they graduate from that. And now they start to see, like, okay, I'm having my traditional quote unquote supersets and I'm learning, okay, I've motor learned how to move in we've been using back squat or sport squat. Let's use sport squat. They learn how to, move better in a sport squat. All right, now they can actually learn how to strain and get stronger. Okay, let's use true linear periodization, Dan John's easy strength, maybe a 5-3-1 where you're doing some max out reps. Cool, you're understanding how to get stronger. Now let's put you on a plan where you're going to actually learn how to maximally, like we're going to do the heavy eccentric where we'll help you up. You'll do the heavy isometric in the bottom. You'll do dynamic effort because it's been 3 years now. You neurologically know how to move properly. You've learned how to lift heavy weight. Now let's teach you how to really, really strain, and then let's teach you how to move things fast. All right, now you've done that. Now we're teaching you how to do it. Let's introduce accommodating resistance. Let's introduce it in the forms of chains, then bands, then both. All right, cool. What are you doing in year 5? Now we'll truly auto regulate you. Hey, man, we're doing this movement. If you're feeling great today and the Tendo shows it, like, or whatever VBT tool you're using, we're going to prescribe a speed instead of a weight because that athlete, like you said, they've earned the right. Like, I know I can trust that athlete. Jesus Gibbs, Luke Hamilton, Deion Cruz Harris, Vinny Schaefer, like Daniel Raymond, those kids, like I had 6. I didn't have a lot, but I knew I could trust those kids to be like, hey man, when that velocity drops below, you're done. Like, or I also used accommodating resistance for those kids where it's like, all right, dude, Vinny, you're a 404. Like you legitimately, I spotted you do 445 for a single. It's terrifying. You're one of the best players. Like, I can't have you get hurt. You know what we're not going to do? I'm not going to heavy barbell bench you 90%, 95%. I'm not. But what I will do is I'll put 80% on the bar with chains to deload you in the bottom. So now you got 365 at the bottom, and then it might get up to 425 at the top. But you're you're increasing your lever, so you're increasing your strength. So I feel safer doing that. And again, it just allows these kids to see like, hey, when I come in, there's quote unquote life at the end of the tunnel, that there is this long-term athletic development progress that, yeah, you're going to go through a little bit of suck. These other kids that are doing the fun stuff, they went through the suck and it's kind of a rite of passage.
Yeah. Yeah. It's that level, that like passage and seeing the tail end of things for sure. The one thing I guess I think with 1x20, well, it may be like the 1 minute answer just because I want to ask you about the power stuff. So sorry this takes too long, but I think about it on the level of like hypertrophy. And like you mentioned, the kid was strong enough. And I've found in my experience, it tends to pack on a lot of muscle on people very easily, especially like hard gainers, people who haven't had much success in other systems. You could say it takes the reps deeper. There's more lactic or there's more of a metabolic, and there's certainly more metabolic effect. But any just take on that with like athletes who might not want to gain a certain amount of weight, like some team sport athletes, or sorry, well, yeah, some team, but like individual sport athletes who want to keep their weight a certain level for an event or something like that, and just any thoughts on that with like muscle mass, muscle gain, armor building, that versus lower rep type stuff.
I usually had athletes that needed to gain weight. So it was more of like, hey, this is a way that you can gain weight by like, look, also understanding that like, it shouldn't just be like, oh, this is an easy 20. It's like, no, no, no. Like we have to, like, that was one of the reteaching, like this needs to be heavy. And like by the reps 14, 15, 16, like that's where it's really starting to suck and not be fun. any of the athletes that were afraid of, getting too big, like when we had our swimmers and divers, like the thing for me is I was really lucky that they wanted to look good. Like, so they
Oh yeah,
liked
oh yeah.
being a little, right?
You're on the
Like
pool deck. You're on the pool deck in a speedo.
exactly,
Of course you want to. Yeah,
exactly. So it's
it's a
like,
big
they're
part of
like,
it.
okay, cool. A lot of reps. Like, this is going to help my muscles look better. And like,
Hmm.
I feel stronger when swimming. So it was never like, I never worked with wrestlers where like they had to
Oh yeah, yeah.
compete
That'd
at
be
a
a good.
certain
Yeah,
weight.
that.
But
Yeah.
even with wrestlers, like what I found with MMA athletes is they're so used to doing a lot of reps anyways. And it's like, hey, it's only one set of 20 instead of 30. So it was a little bit easier buy-in with them when I trained my pro boxer.
Yeah, that's what I would have probably. That would have been a better question. As weight class athletes, MMA and boxing
Yeah.
and things like that. Yeah. So I'm
But they're
sure.
just so used to doing a lot of reps that telling them that it's just one set of a lot of reps. Cause
Sure.
like he's like, you go into a BJJ gym or any MMA gym, like 15 is usually the minimum, maybe tens, but
Interesting.
like they're just used to doing a lot of reps. So if you're like,
Yeah.
hey, it's one set of a lot of reps to get you tons of different movement patterns, that was the easier. So
Yeah, I could see it too for them if a weight gain was an issue, like if they were getting a little bulky, like just kind of almost moving to more auxiliaries or something. Because it's such a versatile system. You could kind of bend where the reps are going a little bit too.
and you would be like, hey, we're gonna back squat a 1x20, but then like, do you really think you're gonna get super big by doing, a standing, excuse me, laying on your back doing a hip flexor training exercise, or standing on an incline and you have the kettlebell on your ankle and you're doing some isolative work for your hip flexor? Like, that's not gonna pack on. There's not enough of a strain systemically, like adductor stuff, like, that's not gonna help you there. That's not going to hinder your body weight. That's just going to help your muscles be stronger.
Yeah, cool. All right, hey, let's get to this. I need to get to this question. We've had a lot to talk about. So, okay, power training. I know I think you've been on a few podcasts talking about this. Basically, like moving away from Olympic lifts. What are you using in place of them? And things that are going through your mind when it comes to power training for athletes beyond the Olympic lifting setup.
So, in this, we utilize this with football team and with the throwers, which two groups of athletes that typically love Olympic lifts.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason being is you can lift more weight, and these athletes don't Olympic lifting competition. There is not a need to do a clean from the floor or from the hang, in the power, catch in the power or catch all the way in the bottom, because that is a very highly technical movement. Everybody understands that, yet everybody forgets that when you try to talk about getting rid of it. If you look like back in the day, why people did it, they said, well, these athletes are the best. Sure, Olympic lifters are very powerful, but and they'll do some sprinting. What they don't do is they don't go run routes. They don't run slants. They don't run a fade. They don't learn how to, break down and make a dig route look like a fade route. That doesn't matter to them. They just have to get the expression of max velocity, doing some sprint work, whether it be a short distance. Same thing with your team sport athletes. If it's a track and field athlete, they don't have to catch a bar, but it's good for them to have a strong posterior chain and to be explosive. So to replace a hang clean or a hang power clean, you would do an RDL to right below your knee, and then you would pull it as fast as you can. If you have a VBT tool, you would utilize that as well. And anybody knows that you can RDL more than you can hang clean. So you're overloading the hips with more weight, and you can move more weight at high speeds by doing an RDL, not a pull, just do an RDL. Then you would rack it, take your time, and you would walk over to do a version of a weighted jump. This can be bar on the back jumps. It can be trap bar, dumbbells. You can go static to dynamic, whatever you want to do, but you want it on a device that will give you jump height. So that way, A, you can record it and track progress over time. But B, so the athletes can talk to each other and, hey, oh, what'd you do? You held 30s and you jumped 22 inches. Oh, word, I'm better than you. I held them and I jumped 23. Now you're trying to jump higher than me the next time. Then the third movement would be an altitude landing, because your altitude landing will get you higher ground reaction forces than catching a clean. So now you've been able to lift a heavier weight because you're doing an RDL instead of the clean. You are producing greater velocities with your weighted jump than by doing your clean. And then you have greater ground reaction forces from your altitude landing versus doing the clean. So because of all of those factors, that was the aha moment that went off. And it was Jeff Jones at Arkansas State that told me about it. And so, just like I recommended everybody else, I heard him say it to me. And I was like, let me try this. I tried it with myself, loved it. Tried it with my throwers, loved it. Took a group of athletes that I knew hated the clean and that medically couldn't do it because they had wrist injuries. So they did it. And then we ran a statistical analysis of their fly 10 ACL and vertical jump versus everybody else that cleaned. And there was no statistical difference. So once I had all of that data, we then just made the wholesale change.
Gotcha. So basically, there was the same, you said no statistical difference. So there was the same improvement curve, whether you did Olympic lifts or did the RDL weighted jump altitude. They both improved the same.
They both improved. And I had kids that didn't do the Olympic lift hit lifetime PR. So if you can improve and you can hit a lifetime PR not doing it, and I can save time, because there's a couple guys when I used to do it, like you spend time doing warm-up sets and teaching progressions. And if I can get kids, now if I can steal some time from there, because your power complex, you can get through four rounds of stuff in 8 minutes. And now I have more time to do the max effort lifting that I want to do, or get more auxiliary work done, or stay on the field longer, whether it's sprint work or conditioning work. I can spend more time doing those things because I've just broken the clean into its constituent parts. The, movement, the first pull essentially from knee to hip, and then triple extension. I know it's not true weighted triple extension in a clean. And then the ground reaction forces. That is why once he told it to me, because I could never just replace a clean with a weighted jump. That didn't equate. They didn't look enough alike, right? It didn't look the same. It didn't smell the same. It didn't feel the same. But to put a bar in your hand and to do the RDL, to do the jump, to do the land, or if you want to replace it from the floor, do a clean grip deadlift, do a version of a jump, do the altitude landing, or a band resisted jump, or a band assisted jump. Now it starts to feel like that other movement. And now you're letting kids express things more athletically. Like an example, our skill players, instead of always doing the weighted jump, we would do an approach jump, or we would give them we had a bunch of foam dodgeballs and we didn't have low level dunks, but we would do pretend dunks, and they would go and they would do a windmill and like slam it into the low ceiling that we had. So like they're getting to be expressive and they're doing all of these things. And then when you went and looked at their counter movement jump, it went up, and it's just like, I couldn't argue with that. And, not that we had a ton of wrist injuries, but you just you don't have kids having, doing this after a clean. Like anybody's just always like, right? Like me personally, I love the weight room. I hated catching cleans. I have long arms. Like it's just not what athletes have to do when they play their sport. Keep the main thing, train them on the field, find less time in the weight room. And that's what we did.
Yeah. I know. I think between you and I think maybe we have different biases, right? Like, where does your bias stem you from? Like, I really enjoyed the Olympic lifts. I also took them too far in my own career, like to the point where my best Olympic lifting year in college was one of my worst jumping years because I think too much.
There it is.
But that being said, I've also had a lot of success with them too. And I kind of found where they fit and how to really work in the sweet spot zone. And I do program them. But like you said, like with the wrists, like tennis, I was like, I don't, it's funny because I remember when I first got to Cal, the tennis program wanted me to take like a strength coaching for tennis, whatever certification. And in that cert, they had tennis players doing Olympic lifts. And I remember I was looking at it, I was like, nah, I'm good. I don't think. And this is like someone who was just doing the kids the track kids I was coaching at Wilmington, we were doing like 20 sets of one and all this stuff, like on Olympic lifts. And I was just like, I just don't think we need to do this for that. But I was just going to say, you and I, we each have our own bias, but like Nick DeMarco himself was, you mentioned Nick, like he was a phenomenal Olympic lifter himself. And I don't think he uses them with his football team, if I'm not mistaken. So, I guess it's one thing to think about where does your coaching, come from based off your bias, but then objectively speaking, you have people like Nick who are great at Olympic lifts, but then find a place not to use them. So I do think it's the one thing I'll say, because again, I think this could be a longer discussion. And at some point, I guess the only thing that really matters is, does the session flow well? Are the athletes bought in? Are you getting the adaptations you want? Like, are those things checked off? Yes, no, But I do the landing is interesting because I know I've seen the force plate data if you do a clean on a force plate, and it's
Yep,
like
that's what we did.
the biggest spike is on the catch, like the ting, and so. But I think that all spikes aren't created equally in the sense that I would actually prefer an altitude drop landing to a clean catch from in the sense of that clean catch is a little bit more top down, meaning the bar hits the shoulders and the pressure wave almost has to start. I mean, it does bottom up from the feet too, but there's a lot more top down. There's a lot more spine, back, hips versus an altitude drop is almost the opposite. It's feet, ankles, intrinsics going up. And well, what's more athletic? It for the most part, unless you're like just beating on people on the line in the trenches or something, I guess, or whatever. But for the most part, it's going to be foot up stuff. So I tend to prefer that thing. But so I like that piece of it. It seems like there's a lot of potential there, and even too like people who have been doing Olympic lifts, like almost the novelty of hey, we're going to take the component parts of this. I'd be curious if you did Olympic lifts, took a cycle break to do those 3 component parts, and actually came back. I'd be kind of curious what might happen to the Olympic lifts for people who do use them. You know what I'm saying? Like I just think that's an interesting complex you have there for sure. With I think
And
the potential there.
and we actually like saw a kid who, and that's the thing, we never tried to drive it up, and like 275 was a big number for this one kid, and we hadn't cleaned in forever. And I was like, God, put it on the bar. And he did it. He's like, holy cow. I was like,
Yeah.
yeah, because we still got like,
Yeah.
you still had the ability to touch it because we were still doing strong things.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of the session flow, like when we were introducing it, we had some kids that were cleaning, some kids that weren't. And the kids that were cleaning, they're like, wait a minute, what's everybody else doing? Like, what is that? That looks like fun. Like, how come I'm like, I want to do that instead of like, and sure, you could do all those extra jumps in addition to the cleans. But we just broke it up into the constituent parts. And our kids, after a while, there was not even really a question. It was just like, oh no, we do this instead. But I think what did help was we still snatched and jerked. Like we would still barbell snatch, we still
Oh,
jerked.
got it. Yeah.
Like we would barbell snatch from either blocks or from the hang because I still love snatch and jerks for just a heavy load overhead, right? Like
Sure.
because you're going to do more than you can standing barbell press. So, we would behind the neck jerk it with spotters. We'd behind the neck split jerk with spotters. We did not spot a front jerk and we did not spot a front split jerk, but we would still do jerks and snatches, dumbbell snatches as well.
Got it. Okay. So yeah, you snuck that in there on me, Justin. I was like,
It's kind of like the 1 by 20. You don't always do just 20 reps.
Yeah,
You do some 14s and 8s. So it's
yeah.
like, yeah, we got rid of cleans, not like that's the major Olympic lift one.
Yeah. I mean, in so many ways, I think you'd ask coaches what's more athletic. I mean, snatch fundamentally in many ways. So, there you go. And now that makes, what I was going to say, and then you said you had that as well, that you did do the snatches and things. Is I just think the moral of the story to me is comment on this or whatever your thoughts are, but like just don't let the Olympic lifts, whatever you do, outrun the component athleticism that drives them. Meaning, the altitude drop ability. To me, it's even bounding. I would track people at bounding ability and bounding combos and those things, medicine ball throws, explosive throws, all those things. If you just go ham on cleans and none of those other things are really getting better, be like, oh man, if I just get my clean better, that'll drag all them up. I found it doesn't really work that way. Sometimes a little from a stimulation perspective, maybe a little like global stimulation. Oh yeah, hit a heavy clean, feeling good, like cool. But in terms of just the way the body works, that's kind of how I see it. Like, and you have the components there. So yeah, be curious your take on that thought.
No, and that's exactly why. Like we kept the main thing. Like our linemen would do. Typically, they go a static overcome by dynamic, but then realistically, as we're diving into what each day looked like, all right, well, if we're going to do that heavy force dominant day of A-cell dominant, well, we would do a clean grip deadlift followed by a probably a trap bar jump, but it was a static jump. So like, because it's, hey, those deeper angles, or we would do a dumbbell broad jump or a seated, from a seated plyo box to a broad jump horizontally. So we were training those similar qualities. But because we were doing, those athletic things, we were still always touching on those qualities instead of, getting really good at doing a starfish clean with your elbows down. And it's just like, I know the weight went up, but like, goodness gracious.
Yeah, I will say one thing. I have seen the starfish clean. I remember it's funny. I just remember being in college, and there was some guy who lived in my dorm. This is just in the bro gym. He's like, "I'm gonna start doing hang cleans again." I watched him do like 4 sets of 5, and they were all starfish. The next day he's like, "Man, my groin is really sore. You know why, Joel?" Like, it's just funny. But I've seen really good jumpers in track and field hit some insane starfish cleans, and sometimes I almost think to myself, these jumpers are so fast. Like that moment that impulse hits to the point that they can split their feet out that far is just incredible. To be honest, I wouldn't recommend that to people. But I do think it's sometimes I think there is like, I'm like, dang. But it's more like what the athleticism someone has expressing itself in a starfish clean, not that starfish clean being the model of building a good pattern by any means. But I just think of it as amazing how fast some people can, hit that. Yeah, don't train like that. But anyways, I know we've gone a long time here, Justin. Anything that you're up to with Strength Coach Network that you want to let people know about before we take off today or close out the show?
Yeah, biggest thing is, we're able to help coaches stay certified. We have CEUs for Fundamentals 1 and 2, our long form education courses. Both of them are 20 hours long. Both offer 2.0 CEUs. So coaches that are CSCS certified through the NSCA, we are able to help you stay certified, give you quality education from people like Dr. Brian Mann, Nick DeMarco, Cam Joss, Jeff Jeff Moyer, Terrence Kennel, coaches in there that have taught. This course is fantastic and it'll help you stay certified. And there's a reason that I purchased Strength Coach Network, because as a or as a member, I loved all the education, ate it all up. So yeah, that's the biggest thing that we got going on.
Sounds good. Well, hey, thank you so much for being on the show, Justin. It was awesome talking to you, man.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
That finishes another episode. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.